In the US, there's something called Ancestry DNA testing. It's S when you spit into a vial or swab the inside of your mouth and send off your genetic material to find out where your relatives came from. Millions of Americans have done it, and there's a good reason for that. The US is a nation of immigrants. People move there from all over the world, including many countries that don't share a lot of history like China and Ireland. So if you want to know about your family tree, tracing it back can be tough. This is especially true if your ancestors were enslaved people whose families were torn apart and who might have been brought to the US from dozens of different places in Africa. All those answers are locked away in your DNA, and thanks to services like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, finding them is easier than ever before. But what's fascinating about this trend is not just that it exists, it's also what Americans want to do with their DNA. In other words, the kind of questions they're asking. And my favorite example comes from this New York Times article about a woman named Yolanda Walls. She took one of these tests and found out that her ancestors were from what is now Cameroon. But she didn't stop there. She dug through records in Cameroon and eventually tracked down a relative, a 74-year-old woman named Marie. According to the Times, Marie's father was born in what was then called the Cameroon Shed. He was born in 1916, 10 years after the United States acquired its independence from colonial rule. That means he was born under foreign rule. So why did her ancestor leave Cameroon? Was it because of slavery or colonialism or both? Well, again, we have to turn to DNA. The Times explains that DNA can tell us roughly when our ancestors left a certain place, but not necessarily why. This is what's known as a genetic genealogy. It looks at the genetic differences between populations over time to answer questions about migration and shared ancestry. By comparing her DNA to others, Yolanda learned that her ancestors had probably lived in Cameroon until the early 1900s. She also learned that her family wasn't alone. Between 1880 and 1910, thousands of Western Cameroon people migrated to the US, most of them men. But why they left still isn't clear. That's the thing about DNA. Yes, it can tell you a lot about your ancestry, but it doesn't have all the answers. If you want to understand why your ancestors did what they did, you need to do more research. You need to read the records they left behind. But here's the amazing thing. Because of advances in genetics, we've reached a point where this kind of research is possible. We can learn things about our past that we never knew before, and that includes learning about our own biases and blind spots. As the Times points out, these DNA tests tend to focus on Europeans. Ancestry.com, for example, says on its website that its customers are mostly interested in learning about their British, Irish, and German roots. That makes sense, given the huge number of European immigrants who moved to the US during the 19th century. But it also reflects the fact that many Americans assume that Europe is where all the interesting stuff happened. Africa, Asia, and Latin America often get overlooked. That's why some geneticists are trying to change how these tests work. The more datasets they have, the better their results will be. And that includes datasets from people of color. One of the geneticists quoted in the article says, "We can only take the science so far. What happens next depends on people's willingness to share their DNA." So this raises a question. Are Americans living up to the challenge? Are they interested in learning about more than just their European roots? We can find out by looking at what these companies actually offer. Let's go back to 23andMe. Their autosomal DNA test, which is the one that most people take, can tell you your ethnic composition. But what does that mean exactly? Well, it means your customer support team will reach out to you and ask you to fill out a survey about what you'd like to know. So, depending on what you say, you could learn a lot, or you could learn very little. For example, let's say you want to learn about your African roots. 23andMe offers two different reports. One is called the Africa Origins. It costs $199 and it gives you a rough idea of where your ancestors are from. The other is called the Africa Deep Ancestry Service, and it costs $499. That report goes a bit deeper. It shows you which regions of Africa your ancestors are most closely related to, as well as some details about your genetic mutations. But if you want to learn about your Asian roots, you won't find any reports on 23andMe's website. That's because the company doesn't offer any specific reports on Asian ancestry. They do, however, offer a health predisposition test that covers various conditions that affect people of Asian descent. So it seems like even though 23andMe has customers who are interested in learning about their Asian roots, the company is not willing to meet that demand. Maybe it's because the Asian American population is relatively small compared to the European American population. Or maybe it's because the company doesn't have enough data on Asian populations. Whatever the reason, it's a missed opportunity. But let's take a look at another company, Ancestry.com. They have a similar product to 23andMe, and they also have a lot of data on European Americans. But they're trying to improve their service for people of color too. In the past year, they've added more than 16 billion records to their database. Some of these are from Africa. There's the 1911 Nigeria voters list, the 1890 Lagos colony voters list, the 1906 Sierra Leone voters list, and several South Africa electoral rolls from the 1900s. These lists include names, ages, occupations, and more. So it's a great resource for anyone trying to track their African roots. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for their Asian offerings. A quick search of their website turned up only one result. There's a book called The Chinese in the British Columbia Gold Rush. That's pretty disappointing. Again, we're dealing with a massive company that's constantly adding new records. So maybe they'll improve their Asian offerings in the future. But as of right now, there's not much to see here. It's a bit frustrating because as more and more Americans take these DNA tests, the more valuable the results become. That's because each test adds to the company's database. So the more diverse that database is, the better everyone's results will be. Of course, this kind of research isn't about pleasing everyone. There are limits to what we can know about our past. And sometimes what we want to know isn't what we need to know. Sometimes all the digging in the world won't give us the answers we want. But there's no denying that knowing our roots can be a powerful experience. It lets us connect with our ancestors in a whole new way, and it lets us better understand ourselves and our place in the world. In the meantime, we can keep searching for answers. Thanks for watching.